Thank you very much. I've been with the World Bank pretty much a year now, and when I come back here to this conference, I start wondering if the good old days were not the good old days. I will talk a little bit about the policy developments, but also how flows have developed over the past few years and some of the forecasts that we have. And also look a little bit into remittance prices and maybe try to explain a bit more why the prices are still a concern to many governments and to policymakers. When you're in the US and you're in the money transfer industry, I know it doesn't seem as if prices are very high. The margins seem to be very small, so maybe some here in the room wish the prices would be higher, and I can understand that to a degree, and I think also the bank and many policymakers are beginning to understand this, and the picture and the focus of the policy efforts is beginning to change a little bit. But let me try and work out how this works. There we go. I'll try and run you briefly through what the World Bank actually does in the area of remittances, which I think will help to explain why I'm here and why we do what we do. I'm part of a larger group that's a Payment Systems Development Group, and we are a technical unit in the World Bank that works mainly with central banks across the world trying to improve payment systems. And as you can see, remittances are part of the greater payment systems. There's different areas, retail payments, very large payments, security settlements, and so on. But remittances, because of their importance for development, because of the huge size of the flows, is a separate section in the Payment Systems Development Group. And it's also dealt with in other parts of the World Bank. So there's a whole research department that looks into migration and remittances, and some of the data I'm presenting here comes from the colleagues there. Our main role is to advise governments on remittance policies, for them to reframe the legal framework, to make sure that market access is appropriate, to make sure that financial inclusion works, to address prices where they are too high, to look into competition, to ensure that there's fair competition and level playing field, and so on. The main tool that we're using are what's called the General Principles for International Remittances, which is something that the Bank for International Settlement has developed together with the World Bank. It's a public document, and maybe for people who have a deeper understanding or have a deeper interest in understanding what remittance policy work is all about, it would make sense to read that document because it explains in detail what policymakers want from remittance markets. In any case, money transfer companies play a big role, and I think everybody appreciates that now because they process most of the remittances. They have in many cases the lowest prices, so they are actually furthering policy objectives rather than being a hindrance, and I think that's a big change that has happened in the bank and also with many policymakers, that they're beginning to understand the market more, and that's also very much our role, where we work with central banks and governments. Very often we try to explain how the remittance industry works, how the markets work, why people use the services they are using, what problems exist, mainly for the migrants, but also for the industry and the companies. This is a brief overview of what the general principles I just mentioned address. So it's about data capture, measuring the flows of remittances, the legal framework, the technical infrastructure, which I think is still a big issue in the industry, financial access, which means using remittances to make sure that people get a broader range of financial services, savings accounts, bank accounts, mortgages, and so on. The market structure, which is maybe what is of most interest to the industry. So we work a lot on ensuring that there's sufficient competition, that market entrance for companies is easy, also that anti-competitive behavior is banned or dealt with otherwise. You know, there's problems with exclusivity agreements, there's problems with kickbacks that are sometimes paid by certain providers to ensure that they maintain their position. So we help governments and central banks to adopt policies that address these issues. Consumer protection, of course, there's a lot about transparency in the US recently, and I think there's a separate session, so I won't dwell on that. And then oversight, which I think also will be addressed here later, so it's a topic that I think most people in this room understand very well. Everybody is regulated and has visitors coming to do audits, and hence you understand how oversight works better than I think many policymakers. maybe it's useful to point out some of the benefits. Last time after my speech, some people came to me and say, well, why are you still talking about price reductions? The prices have fallen so much. A lot of companies are not as profitable as they used to be. Some may even be struggling. So what do you actually do for the industry? I think we do quite a bit. And I think one of the biggest areas where I think we try and help the industry is making sure that the legal framework, both the regulation and market access and such things, work in a way that it's easy for the industry to enter new markets, whether that is about getting a license or whether about the licensing regime being appropriate, there being identification requirements that are not an overburden, making sure that all the remittance, all the different companies have access to the payment channels, that there are sufficient payment channels. You know, in many countries you can only use banks, but the banks, the big banks with the large retail networks have exclusivity agreements, so it's sometimes very difficult to get into some of these markets. So we're trying to help governments to change that, to adopt policies that will ultimately also enable microfinance institutions, sometimes retailers, MFIs, and other financial institutions to be able to pay remittances and to do so for a broader range of companies. We generally also advise the governments quite a lot on new payment systems, on new remittance systems, on online and mobile and other things, so that the regulatory framework that is in place is accommodating to these new remittance technologies. Because in some countries there's no legal framework yet for mobile payments, for example. So if a framework is drawn, we work with the government to ensure that remittance companies are part of it, that the regulation covers international money transfers, so that people who get a mobile payments license, for example, will be able to at least function as a payer for a remittance company. Remittances are still a very big topic for many policymakers, for many development organizations, for many governments. And there have recently been a lot of good and bad news, I think. And I think the most noteworthy item is that the G20 has recently adopted the price reduction target that the G8 had adopted a few years back. Maybe some here know there's something that's called the 5x5 objective, which means a reduction of the average global cost of remittances essentially by half over 5 years, 5 percentage point over 5 years. That's why it's called the 5x5 objective. So the G20, which includes all the major send or receiving countries, has adopted a recommendation for the countries to work towards the same objective. And again, I know that price reduction is not the favorite topic, but when we talk about the prices a little bit later, you will see there's many places in the world, many regions, many corridors, where prices are a lot higher than they are in the US. And I think it's now being recognized that the policy initiatives need to be directed to these countries where the prices are still very high. And typically the reason that the prices are high is not because money transfer companies want to charge so much, because it's either very expensive to operate or there's very limited competition. There's only 1 or 2 companies that are able to operate in these corridors, and we're trying to change that, which I think will ultimately help the industry. So it's not about blackmailing the money transfer industry to say, well, they are overcharging migrants. I think that is behind us, and now the policies are a lot more balanced, I think you could say. There's a lot of discussion still about regulation. You've heard some of it in the FATF. There's still a debate about the transaction threshold for identification. There's some countries that want a $0 threshold. There's others that say it should be $5,000, and I think we'll probably balance in somewhere in between, maybe $1,000, $2,000, but too early, I guess, to really say. There's also a debate about what responsibilities money transfer companies should have for the compliance of their agents. There was a drive by some countries to say, well, the money transfer company in the US that uses an agent in Honduras, where money transfer activities are not regulated, needs to make sure that the agent essentially complies with the legal requirements of the company in the US. And the World Bank and the Financial Integrity Unit in the World Bank has made a big pushback together with other countries against this, because it means that all of a sudden you have 2 jurisdictions applying to your compliance, and we think that's wrong. That's maybe another example of how the bank addresses issues that are of importance for the industry, and how we're trying to help the industry by keeping regulation more balanced. There's been quite a lot of activities of different countries either providing funding or hiring us or other advisors to address their remittance markets. And whilst in the past the typical pattern would be that donor countries such as the G8 countries would provide funding for us to do work in the receiving countries, that is now beginning to change a little bit, and many of the sending countries in the G20 are beginning to realize that they also need to do work on their side. They need to look at their legal framework, they need to look at their markets, they need to measure the policies that they have. So we are working with a number of G8 large sending countries now that want to address their markets and also, of course, their main corridors. And I think that's also a change, and I think that's a welcome change, because it's very difficult to address remittance policies only on the receiving side. I mean, many things, legal framework and so on the send side actually matter more, so we are quite happy that we are now able to work on both sides of the equation. Let me talk a little bit about the flows. As I said, the World Bank has a big research group that looks into remittance flows and into migration. As you can see on this chart, the flows had pretty much to all regions were reducing in about 2009. And I think many people here in this room have felt this in their own business, so I don't need to tell you how strong this impact was. But fortunately, the flows have bounced back. They're not growing as quickly as they used to before. You will see that in further information that I will give you. But at least you have a growth trend again in almost all places. And the flows are back to similar levels. So the market size has stabilized again, and I think is at least on a much more positive pattern than it used to be in 2009 and at the beginning of 2010 at least. So here you see the flows to different regions, and you see in some places the dip that happened in 2009 was stronger than in others. Latin America took a relatively strong dip and is also not bouncing back as strongly as some markets in Asia, for example. Here is an overview of different remittance flows to Africa. And you can see there that in most cases you have a similar pattern. Remittances dipped in 2009, and they're now growing again. If you look at the overall trends, in almost all countries you see a growth rate. Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, well, and recently also Northern Africa, is maybe the biggest policy concern, because the prices there compared to international levels are extremely high. Transfers to sub-Saharan Africa and within sub-Saharan Africa are the most expensive ones in the world. And I think the margins there are also very interesting, but as I heard from discussions I have with many of the money transfer companies, also a very difficult market to get into. So I think one objective of our work and of policies has to be to make the remittance markets in Africa be more accessible for money transfer companies, because unless we get more competition, the prices will not come down. I mean, there can be as many policies as you like. If there are no providers that offer a lower cost option, of course prices will not fall. And we have a relatively large Africa project, and we are trying to address this issue. We're working with, sometimes individually with banks or with other types of payers, post offices, for example, and trying to give them better payment systems, trying to enable them to become remittance payers, both in terms of the regulatory framework, but also in terms of their operational capacity. So we do technical assistance to post offices so that they are able to work with a number of remittance companies and become more reliable partners and can deliver the customer service that you need to be successful.